Hello, and welcome to the MGL Common Endorsements webinar. Today what we're going to look through is 18 endorsements you'll commonly find on the back end of a marine general liability or ship repairer's legal liability or a combination policy. I often like to look at a marine policy from the back, look at these exclusions first before looking at the actual coverage to see what you're left with. But you see on the screen that these endorsements either fall into one or three categories. The ones that are in green with a little green traffic light on there, which are the good endorsements. 3 endorsements in red with the red stop sign on there, or stop light on there, which are really endorsements that have got some problems. And lastly, the last group at the bottom with sort of the caution light on there. They're shown in black on the screen. And they're ones where you need to be aware of them, but largely they're either covered elsewhere or there's a specific reason that you should be concerned with this endorsement. So let's jump right in with the MRAM endorsement. And I always think that reading it is the simplest start because it gives you the answer usually to what is not covered. It's agreed that any occurrence or accident otherwise covered by this policy resulting in an action in rem of any vessel owned, operated or chartered by the insured shall in all respects be treated in the same as though the action resulted therefrom was in personam. And here you've got a couple of the legal terms here. In personam is a suit against a person. It could be a corporation, it could be an individual, a partnership, but that's an in personam suit. An action or suit in rem is a suit against a physical piece of property. In this particular case, a vessel. So why should you sue a vessel? Well, you sue a vessel because that's typically the largest single asset that this insured may have, and you don't want it escaping out of the territory where you can attach it should you win that suit. So an action in rem can allow you not only to sue the vessel, but in many cases to have the vessel arrested and a bond or some other form of guarantee be posted before that vessel can trade again, can go and move away from its home dock. So what this clause does simply is says if somebody sues a vessel as opposed to suing the person, we're still going to cover you, and there's no difference there. The interesting part of this particular clause is it's usually added to the back end of a marine general liability policy, which in its own right doesn't provide that vessel coverage. That would be a P&I, protection indemnity policy. Nevertheless, a lot of people like this. It's a nice sleep easy. It doesn't really change a lot. Here it's not giving you any additional coverage. It's effectively adding the vessel as a named insured under the policy. Pretty simple, gets a green light. It's a positive, but not much of a positive. The next one is the travelling workman endorsement. And this goes on to the back of the ship repairer's legal liability form. The ship repairer's legal liability form is a location-specific coverage. What this endorsement simply does is allow you to take that coverage and move it around to wherever the insured is working at the time. It's interesting, particularly when you see the small marine contractor, maybe the artisan contractor, who works out of the back of his truck, has a ship repairer's coverage in force, but doesn't have this endorsement. In that case, his only coverage is there when he's back in his home shop or garage where he works from, and not when he's on the road doing the real repair work that they get paid for. This travelling workman endorsement is usually a freebie. I don't know an underwriter that charges for it. It's great coverage. In fact, it's essential coverage for just about every business you can imagine that repairs any types of vessels. Even the shipyard itself could send somebody to another port to complete some work or inspect some work before a vessel is coming into their shipyard. Great coverage, simple to get, essential to have on the policy. The other work endorsement pretty well goes the same way. Here again, we're extending the ship repairer's legal liability policy to cover any other care, custody, control exposure we might have that's beyond ship repair. So let's just say one day somebody comes into our facility, wants something welded, maybe a chair, anything that's not related to a ship or a vessel. We want to do that job, but we then have that chair or piece of equipment in our care, custody, control. If we do not have this other work endorsement on it, we don't have coverage for that piece of equipment whilst it's in our care, custody, control. Again, this is a great endorsement. It's not perhaps a huge exposure for most marine businesses, but it could be. Care, custody, control for anything other than vessels, cargo, anything that's not already covered by that ship repairer's legal liability form. Start now moving into some of these more questionable endorsements. And here you see both the red and yellow light together. These are English traffic lights, and that's how we show them in England. Think of it as just the single amber or yellow light if you're here in the States. Caution, but not terrible. This policy does not cover any actual or alleged liability to employer's liability where the claim is made or injury took place in a state when the insured is a non-participant or non-subscriber to the regular programs established by the state workers' unemployment policy or disability laws, statutes or regulations, or to any leased or hired-in worker. Again, this is just saying your general liability, your marine general liability policy is not going to step in and become a workers' comp policy or an employer's liability policy where you don't have that, you're not in the workers' comp system. Further, it doesn't provide coverage to any leased or hired-in worker. Again, they should be coming with their own coverage from the people that you're hiring in. Contract labour should typically come with their own coverage. Or you should cover them under your own workers' comp. That's something you work out one way or another. Decent clause, nothing to be concerned about. Again, probably most of an issue in places like Texas, where there is no particular legal requirement to make you write workers' comp with employer's liability. The next one is hired and non-owned auto liability. Again, if you have employees that use their personal auto or go out and rent auto to use in the course of your business, this covers that exposure. Good endorsement, nothing untoward in here, but there is a lot of scrutiny on this endorsement. It used to be a freebie that most marine underwriters would add in without any questions, but there have been a couple of large claims arised out of heavy non-owned and hired auto. So underwriters today are asking a lot more questions. How many non-owned autos are there? How often do you hire? What's the type of autos that you are hiring or your employees are using? What's the frequency? Those are the types of questions that are popping in now, really to identify and probably for the first time really underwrite that exposure in a marine environment. Look at liability coverage. Here the typical marine general liability, and this is not in every one of them, will pay on behalf of the insured all sums which the insurer shall become legally obligated to pay as damages for bodily injury or property damage arising from the selling, servicing, furnishing of alcoholic beverages. This is liquor law coverage. Again, you've got to look very much at the specific policy to see if this is being granted or perhaps excluded. There's a liquor liability coverage exclusion as well. This one's the coverage, which is why it gets the green light. Good news, generally a endorsement that most people will charge for. This exclusion in this particular endorsement does not apply to any liability, injury or damage arising out of any alcoholic beverage sold, served or furnished while the required license is not in effect. If your insured doesn't have that license, then the coverage is voided. It also excludes causing or contribution to the intoxication of any person, furnishing of alcoholic beverages to any person under the legal drinking age, already under the influence of alcohol, and any statute, ordinance or regulation to the sale, gift, distribution or use of alcoholic beverages. So there are some limitations in this coverage, but again, better coverage than none at all for liquor law. If you really have a significant liquor law exposure, then go out and buy a separate liquor law policy. Health hazard clause, you're seeing this creep into more and more policies here. It's excluding all the standard common health hazards: asbestos, tobacco, coal, dust, polychlorinated biphenyls, silica, benzene, talc, dioxin, pesticides or herbicide, electromagnetic fields, pharmaceuticals or medical drugs, products or substances and devices, or any substance containing such materials or derivative thereof. We're just not covering any of those. Also, we're seeing the HIV, acquired immune deficiency syndromes, cumulative trauma, repetitive motion or strain, and carpal tunnel being excluded from these. That can be a little more problematic. Look at your company and seeing what their own form excludes. This varies from company to company. There's no standards here. At a minimum, make sure your client knows that there is a health hazard exclusion and what that particular one does exclude. Occupational disease, again, getting fairly common here. We have an employer's liability exclusion, generally speaking, but even if you push that back in, occupational disease is coming in as an exclusion. This would be particularly if you're adding things like a stopgap liability policy in the monopolistic states or in Canada. Again, this occupational disease exclusion will creep up quite often on the marine general liability policy. The radioactive contamination exclusion, again, pretty straightforward here. I don't think anybody expects an insurance policy other than a very specific one to cover radioactive contamination. I'm not going to read through all the wording on this one. There's just no point. Again, just be aware that the radioactive exclusion is in virtually every insurance policy today. Sometimes it's built into the wording itself. Sometimes it's an add-on by endorsement, as in this example, but it's there just about across the board. Professional liability, I think it's always been clear that a general liability policy, whether it be marine or dry, does not cover professional liability. But some underwriters do like this additional exclusion, just to clarify that. We're not going to cover anything resulting from or incurred by reason of any act, error or mistake committed or alleged to be committed on behalf of the insured in rendering or failing to render service of a professional nature. Engineers, surveyors, people like that, they're rendering an opinion. That's professional liability. Should not be covered under a GL policy. And if you have that exposure, there is a very specific general professional liability product out there. There's some specific marine professional liability products as well. Cautionary words there, but again, I don't think that's really changing anything in the intent of the GL policy. It's just clarifying on certain policies where there's no existing clear professional liability exclusion in that policy. Punitive damages, this is always an interesting exclusion. It's added to a lot of marine general liability policies today. But a lot of the time the punitive damages could be the carrier's handling of the claim. And I think that there is an argument then that the carrier, if they mess up the handling of the claim, they could be subject to punitive damages regardless of this exclusion. This exclusion really is where there's punitive damages against the insured. Many states say you can't insure for punitive damages anyway, so this is a second layer in those states. But for the states that do allow the insurance of punitive damages, this does take away any fines, punitive or exemplary damages from coverage. Again, I don't think the GL policy was ever really intended to cover this, so I don't think it's a huge change. It's just a clarification or a certainty that it's not covered in the Marine General Liability policy. Again, carrier specific, not every carrier requires this, but many do. Similarly, employment practices, again, this is employment practices liability coverage is its own coverage. This again says the GL policy, the Marine General Liability policy, does not cover employment practices liability. It's not worth going through the individual wording. It's going to vary by carrier. But if you have that exposure, as virtually everybody does, go out and buy an EPL policy on a monoline basis. Some carriers will add it back in. It is a buy back into a few policies, but it is pretty rare in the marine environment. You're probably better off with a monoline carrier. Particularly if you do have a claim, those monoline carriers are generally better set up to react to the claim, provide you with the necessary legal support you might need. Gas freeing. This is really a raise your hand and tell me type of exclusion. This policy will not indemnify the insured for any loss, damage or liability, including legal fees as a result of gas freeing operations, including stripping, blowing and other similar activities related to gas freeing work performed by any insured hereunder. Clearly, many marine contractors and marine shipyards will do gas freeing, but here we're going to require a certified chemist to get involved in the certification of that gas free. So if your client does any of this work, it's a raise your hand, as I said, identify it to your carrier, start going through the various information requests they may have to be able to either delete or amend this exclusion. Many carriers will add a warranty or a condition to say, unless there is a certificate issued by a certified chemist that confirms that the operation is gas-free. Blanket additional insuring clauses are pretty common today. There usually has to be a written contract. If you only have an oral contract, you're probably going to need to get a specific additional insured for that. I do want to point out a couple of things on here. First of all, it says only in respect to operations performed by or for the named insured. Some smart attorneys have said, oh, you've added this additional insured under the policy, therefore it will cover for everything that they do. They're trying to get more limits of coverage. That's never been the intent of the GL policy, and this, I think, clarifies it. And the other point is giving away additional insured status, and I think this can be a problem, particularly when we combine it with the next endorsement, the waiver of subrogation. So I'll deal with it a little bit more when we talk about waivers. Just worth here just to talk about the different named insureds and how they are incorporated in the policy. The first named insured, duty to pay premium, and they're the only ones that can change coverage. You can have additional named insureds in the named insured section. That'll protect them for suits. This might be a subsidiary or a parent company. It could be a sister company. There's no duty to pay premium or right to make changes by that additional named insured. Then we have our additional insured. This might be somebody we're working from or a shipyard we're trying to enter. They're just listed as a straight additional insured, often called a certificate holder. There's no right to cancel or amend coverage. There's no right to a copy of the policy or endorsements unless the insured, the first named insured, authorize it. And then we're going to give them a certificate insured and possibly an additional insured endorsement if requested, as many of them do today. Why be an additional insured? Clearly that protects you in the event of a claim, particularly the scatter suits you see today. Attorneys will name 20, 30 people on the same suit. This protects at least for defense costs, even if there's no liability there. But the question is, why to provide that status? If you're the shipyard and somebody asks you to name them as additional insured, you're bringing their claim effectively under your policy. So be cautious not to give it out just randomly. Make sure it's necessary in the course of the business. As I mentioned, waiver of subrogation often goes with that. And here's where it really can come back and bite you. Here you're waiving this subrogation against some additional insured, somebody you're working for. Again, possibly a marine contractor working or an artisan contractor working in a shipyard or for a principal. The problem here is you may have to give it, but you're also giving away potentially your loss experience. If you're working in that shipyard and the injury to a third party is purely that shipyard's fault, and you have this waiver of subrogation clause in your policy, then you cannot sue that shipyard. It could be their fault, it could be $1 million loss, but you can't go back and collect from them. And that just hits your loss history for the future. So don't give it away willy-nilly, just make sure you think about it before you issue that waiver of subrogation. Seepage pollution, good clause. It's included in most marine general liability policies for free, but the coverage is very limited. This is sudden and accidental. You've got to know about it within 72 hours, and you've got to report it within 30 days. So it's a definite claims made type of form. We don't cover anything arising out of substance, subsurface oil and gas, fines or penalties, criminal defence, blowout or cratering, pollution emanating from a watercraft which is owned or bareboat chartered to the insured. We've got an OPA type pollution policy, vessel pollution policy, to cover that. And this is the one that I really don't like. It's not in every policy, but a lot of these seepage and pollution calls any site or location used in whole or part for the handling, processing, treatment, storage or disposal, or dumping of any waste material or substances, or the transportation of any waste material or substances. Within a shipyard, you're going to have bilge water, you're going to have engine oil, used engine oil, maybe some black water, types of things like that which you are going to be handling, at least in some cases. May not be your main business, but if you look at this exception, it says used in whole or part. So carrying a drum of 5-10 gallons worth of waste handling, used engine oil, for example, out of your location and disposing of it is definitely in foul of this limitation. In theory, this takes away all the coverage. It's not just the spillage of this waste material and substances, it's the whole site goes away should you do any of these functions at that site. Probably should have a yellow light on this one. It's a little cautionary. It sounds like you're getting real seepage and pollution, but you're not quite getting as much as it appears. Part of the seepage and pollution is that it doesn't constitute evidence of financial responsibility under the OPA Act. Again, there's an OPA, a vessel OPA policy for that, which is a much better place to be that. Discovery clause is really bad clause. You've got 4 red lights on this one. This was somebody's attempt to make a occurrence form into a claims made by giving you a 12-month time after policy expiration to report a claim. Otherwise, the policy was gone. Biggest single problem with this, it wasn't like a claims made policy where if you kept renewing it, you had a retro date and you could keep that in place to get long term. Each policy stood in its own right and went away after that 12-month period. Even more of a problem is the statute of limitations on most admiralty claims is 3 years. So if the person chooses to sue you 15 months after policy expiration, there's no coverage. And there's no coverage in any subsequent policy either, even if you renew and renew and renew. This clause is often buried into the policy. It's not necessarily a separate exclusion on the back end. So it's a very nasty one if you don't find it early in the place. If you see those words, discovery clause, sometimes it's called a claims reporting clause. You've got 12 months to report a claim. It's a very bad news, and you want at least to get it to 36 to get to that statute of limitations. Preferably get rid of it altogether. Find a different carrier if you can. It's a bad clause. You should not be using this in policies. So there we have it. 5-6 clauses here, good ones, 3 bad ones, and then the balance of them are sort of cautionary, but nothing too good or bad. I want to thank you for your attendance. We'll hand you back to the studio now for questions.